All right, I still see some people trickling in, but in the interest of time, we'll get started. Good afternoon, good morning. My name is Kirsten Verklas. I'm Senior Managing Director at NASEO. I'm excited to have you join this NASEO-NARUC webinar on grid investments for FERC Order 2222. We have some excellent speakers from the GridWise Alliance lined up to talk about their new report. Or upcoming report. But before we get started, we'll do a few slides on NASEO-NARUC for those of you who don't know us, as well as some housekeeping, and then we'll turn it over to GridWise. So NASEO, the National Association of State Energy Officials, we are the national nonprofit association for the governor-designated energy offices and their directors from each of the 50 states, the District of Columbia, and the territories. We serve as a resource to our members on all kinds of issues, ranging from electricity to buildings to finance, but we also advance our members' interest vis-a-vis Congress and the administration. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, our members work on a wide variety of issues, and so does NASEO. So we have programs in electricity, which this webinar falls under, but we also work on financing, workforce, innovation, transportation. We have cross-cutting issues such as equity and resilience and workforce, and our members have programs and policies and priorities on all of these issues. And so NASEO works on all of these issues through different committee structures. This initiative and webinar is co-hosted with NARUC, so I will turn it now over to Sarah Fitzpatrick from NARUC to give a few remarks on NARUC.
Thank you, Kirsten. I'll be very quick. My name is Sarah Fitzpatrick, and I work for the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, or NARUC, and I work on its team at the Center for Partnerships and Innovation. NARUC is a nonprofit started in 1889, and it represents state utility commissions in all 50 states and US territories. And our CPI team is a grant-funded team that provides technical assistance to NARUC state commissions. Next slide, please. And what CPI does is we try to get ahead of emerging issues and connect commissions with expertise and strategies to help inform their decision-making, much like we're trying to do with today's webinar. And if you'd like to find out more about CPI or educational resources and upcoming events, you can visit the website listed at the bottom of this slide. I'll wrap up here, and thank you again. I'll pass it over to Kirsten.
Thank you, Sarah. Just a few words on the NASEO-NARUC DER Integration and Compensation Initiative. This webinar is part of this initiative. This is something that NARUC and NASEO kicked off last year. And it's really designed to support our members, both the state energy offices and the Public Utilities Commission, to understand the impact of FERC Order 2222 in those states that are part of an organized markets, but also to support our members in understanding and working on transmission, distribution, and customer coordination outside of RTO and ISO regions. We hope to inform you all, the key state decision makers. We hope to raise and evaluate risks and opportunities on different decision options as they present themselves through FERC Order 2222 and the implementation process, and bring different perspectives to you all through webinars such as these and other workshops. We have a great advisory group of 10 NARUC and NASEO members who represent diverse regional perspectives and that guide the project. Just a few notes on the housekeeping. This is a Zoom webinar. If you go to the next slide, everybody's muted and off video. We invite you during the presentation to please add questions into the Q&A box or into the chat. We really hope to have this be, about 30-minute presentation, but then really are looking for your guidance and support as the GridWise Alliance is shaping this report for you all. And so hopefully there'll be a lively discussion in the chat and Q&A, and we can get to as many of your considerations and questions as possible. And with that, I'm excited to turn this over to Karen Whalen, the CEO of GridWise Alliance, to get us started.
Thank you very much, Kirsten, and thanks everybody for joining on for those of you on the East Coast time. It's a Friday afternoon. We are working on a report on grid investments to support FERC Order 2222, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. And what we're hoping to get from this conversation, I'm joined by two of my colleagues who are members of GridWise, Rob Pratt from Pacific Northwest National Laboratory and Doug Priest from Black & Veatch. We're going to sort of lay out the premise of our paper, also sort of provide some context for what FERC Order 2222 actually is and how that's going to drive technology deployment and implementation. And then I'm sure that that conversation will generate questions from you, but we're also looking for suggestions from you about how to ensure that the report is most useful to you. So next slide, please. If you don't know GridWise, we're a membership organization that started in 2003 in very close conjunction with the Department of Energy at the very beginning of their development of their smart grid programs and with the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. In fact, I believe that PNNL owns our name for the next 99 years. We are a member organization of utilities. We have 3 of the 5 RTOs. We have Bonneville Power, we have major tech companies and grid manufacturers and consulting companies that work in the grid space. And our mission is to advance grid modernization and talk about the benefits of a modern grid. So next slide, please. One of the things that we kicked off about a year and a half ago was our technology portfolio initiative. And that's designed to sort of make the very complex and rapidly evolving technologies that are being deployed on the grid accessible to policymakers, so that when you're dealing with a rate case, when you're looking at grants, and you're hearing about policy objectives that you'd like to accomplish and that rely on the grid as a platform for those policy objectives, we're trying to sort of shed some light on what the technologies are that are necessary to meet those policy objectives. So the first thing we did is we released a paper called the Technology Portfolio that outlined a series of functional areas that a modern grid will provide: integrated planning, system visibility, real-time operation, consumer and energy services engagement, and emerging grid architecture. And then we laid out a few technology examples with one-pagers, next slide, please, that that provided those kinds of benefits. So if you look at our paper, it'll have basic things like advanced meter infrastructure. It'll have what is it, where is it on the grid, why is it essential for the grid, where is it on the technology maturity curve, and then some case studies. And so that's the first paper that we put out. Next paper, please. Next slide. The next paper that we put out actually came at the request of Pat Hoffman at the Department of Energy, right after they had passed and Congress passed the infrastructure bill, and DOE was grappling with how they were going to structure their programs. And she wanted to know, what do we need to have on the grid right away for accelerated transportation electrification? And so we, in a stakeholder process with our members, put together this paper, Near-Term Grid Investments for Integrating Electric Vehicle Charging Infrastructure. And it lists the kind of the bare minimums that we're going to need in the short term, not for true vehicle to grid integration, farther on, but just to accommodate the increased load and perhaps managed charging. And we wanted to make sure that we were recommending technologies that would be no regret technologies, so that when we finally do get to a place where we've got widespread vehicle to grid integration, you don't have stranded assets. So so this paper came out early last year, and the next paper that we're working on is a paper on the grid technologies that are necessary to support FERC Order 2222. We are also working on a paper on, we've already begun the discussions. The next paper in our series will be resilience technologies. And what we're going to do is use the Section 4101 list that Congress put into the statute of all the technologies, so the projects that are eligible for the 4101 funding, and then list the kinds of technologies that would be funded under each of these categories and the kinds of resilience benefits that you would get from each of these technologies. And of course, one technology may provide multiple benefits. They may enhance resilience, but they also may be critical for truly integrating aggregated DER into the wholesale market. So it's not mutually exclusive, but what we're trying to do is create a series of papers that provide you with a window, if you have a policy objective, to the kinds of technologies that will have to be invested in order to get to that policy objective. So next slide, please. So we're about a month and a half into our working group on grid investments to support FERC Order 2222. Distribution utilities will deploy grid technologies to enable consumers to participate in emerging DER aggregation markets. We have a much more detailed outline than this, but this is going to sort of set the stage for Doug and Rob's conversations with us. So I'm going to turn it over now to Doug Priest of Black & Veatch to kind of give the context for our paper.
Thanks, Karen. Hello, everybody. I'm Doug Priest from Black & Veatch. I'm a managing director in our digital advisory practice there, and I focus on grid modernization and deployment of applications and resources to make that happen. I do spend a lot of time helping our clients with strategies, and they're building that clear path forward for them to, how do they effectively implement and plan for things such as the impacts of FERC Order 2222. So when you look at, the paper, there is, a description of what is FERC 2222, and there are some key areas of impact there. Specifically, metering and telemetry are a big thing. This is a highly data-driven event to participate in, and as well as the grid itself, the infrastructure that is passing the power around. There are some adaptations and adjustments that need to be made to that physical infrastructure, as well as the control of that physical infrastructure. So we have the, how the DERs are actually connected, aggregated, and how they get managed from a market signals perspective. And then from the technology perspective, how does that break down into those one-pagers that Karen provided an overview, as well as other considerations around, there's significant business agreements and management to those agreements that has to be made. So next slide, please. So some of the key impacts that FERC 2222 imparts upon distribution utilities, especially, is these assets, the DERs that are being deployed, if they're on the distribution and it's in a market territory, that distribution system is served by a load serving entity or an LSE. And they have to account for not only their network needs when they go to the market to acquire that energy, but they also have to account for, all of these DERs that are within my footprint that are participating in that wholesale market. Do I net them out? Do I include them? Or, how does all of that take place? And the big thing is you can't double count these. If it's in my territory, from a market perspective, I have to net it out. If it's in my territory from an operational perspective, I need to know everything it's doing, because I have to manage that power flow to the market. So there's somewhat of a dichotomy there of what's my responsibility. And there's, again, I may mention this, highly data driven, and the only way to do that is make sure you have adequate information and the algorithms for forecasting of what's in, what's out, when's it in, when's it out. Those need to be much more sophisticated than what they are today. As well as the communications with those aggregators and even the operators of the assets. They may not be necessarily the same entities. There's a market perspective, and then there's an operational perspective, and we're addressing both in the paper. Billing is a challenge. The DERs participate at the wholesale prices, and accounting for that energy at those costs, and figuring out who's going to bill whom, how that's going to be passed on to parties, and who has access to that information when. That needs to be significantly advanced, more advanced than it is today. So next slide. And, to address the previous items 1 and 2, that data I keep mentioning, a lot of that is, it's the energy information, it's the output information, it's the availability information of those distributed assets. And that includes storage. So with a solar or a wind asset, the electron flow, the energy flow is typically from the asset into the system. However, with storage, there is the need to recharge. And to a certain extent, with some wind in some climates, they do become a load when it gets below freezing for keeping lubricants liquid as opposed to a gel or solid. But anytime there's a inflow to that asset, what price is that at, and what's the agreement that covers that? That all needs to be laid out in the business agreements, as well as appropriately measured and monitored. And AMI is a huge benefit to enabling that. It allows you to see, to back test forecasts. A big item that we see early on is you can't effectively do the forecasts to predict the impact or plan for the impact of the DER assets on the distribution unless you have adequate AMI information. We're talking, multiple years to cover that seasonal effect on the infrastructure and on the the physical plant assets, the pole, the wires and the transformers that have been there for decades. What is that new solar farm going to do to what I've already got in place? Well, if I don't have a good baseline down to the hour, less is even better. 15 minutes would be very good, but it takes that AMI database and to be able to build that reliable forecast and understand the impacts. The other aspect is these DERs on distribution, they can be fractionalized if they're big enough. By that, I mean, a battery is a great example of this. A battery implementation can provide different services at different times, depending on how you manage the controls of that asset. And it's not beyond concept for a battery to be able to provide potentially frequency regulation on the distribution while selling power into the wholesale market. And that technology exists today. It is very difficult to keep track of all of that and understand how do I measure that? How do I validate it? And how do I properly account for it and then compensate for it? Because you're dealing with two entities on the receiving end, and that performance to the business agreements around those, it's two separate business agreements. And I'm measuring multiple aspects of the operation of the asset. So it becomes very difficult to do. And it also, that portion of the asset that's already subscribed or committed into a wholesale market, it can't be double committed. That's a recipe for bad things to happen. So you have to understand the commitment schedule of an asset that you, as the operating utility, the load serving entity, you most likely don't even own it. So there becomes the need for information that some may see is, that's none of your business. Why do you need to know that? So there has to be a mechanism to be able to share that, hopefully share that in advance to enable the daily operational planning for the load serving entity. And the redispatch of DERs, they can't just be redispatched at the wholesale level. without the load serving entity understanding that. And because it's going to have an operational impact on their network to be able to handle those commitments. Next slide. And I think, you know, the key takeaway, this is not easy. This is very technically complex. There's many, many things that have to be taken into consideration. It requires a much better handling and a higher level of sophistication around real-time data, real-time information, the analysis of that information, being able to, you know, look at it from an analytics perspective, which is somewhat in, you know, a historical view, as well as a forward-looking perspective that uses that historical information to provide better forecasts in the future so that the load serving entities can effectively operate. And I think the last one there, you know, significant might be an understatement. When I work with clients, you know, a lot of times you look at what some of these impacts are, and it's the equivalent of potentially going to Mars. And many times we're just trying to help them walk across the street to get on the bus to go to the launch pad to maybe get to the moon. That's where a lot of entities are in their path to being able to accommodate these things. So it is a very technically complex challenge for load serving entities going forward. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Rob to talk about some of the more technology-based aspects of this.
I'm just going to jump in and introduce this slide. The Tennessee Valley Authority has 153 utilities that it serves, and they are working to help all of their utilities move up through the grid modernization pyramid. And Doug mentioned, you know, you know, starting from the bus stop, getting to the, you know, the launch pad. This is what TVA is thinking about in terms of these stages of grid modernization, from, you know, no regrets basic all the way up to optimized. And when we started thinking about what technologies would be necessary for FERC Order 2222, basically we decided that it was all of them, but all of them may provide different sets of capabilities at different times during the stages of early stage DER aggregation through full on DER aggregation, providing services to both the wholesale and distribution markets systems. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rob to start talking about some of these technologies and how we're thinking about describing them to you in this paper. So go for it, Rob.
Thank you, Karen. My name is Rob Pratt. I'm a senior staff scientist at Pacific Northwest National Lab. I led our smart grid activities for most of the last 20 years, in the process of retiring this year. I was there at the day the GridWise Alliance was born, witnessed the signatures on the paper. So we like this pyramid a lot, and we sort of adopted that as a good way to communicate the progression of technologies. And so we want to present the FERC 2222 requirements on technologies in this kind of fashion. So we're going to kind of adopt this as a basic communication paradigm imagery. Next slide, please. So what I'm going to show you is just we'll sample the process to sort of explain what the information we're trying to assemble and communicate, and so you could sort of see what the basis for our discussions are, and for the rationale behind why a given technology is needed, and what in particular special elements may be needed associated with FERC 2222 that may not be high on everybody's radar screen already. So each row here is an item in the pyramid, and we're describing, first of all, who's deploying that technology. So in the past, you would sort of naturally think that these are all utility, but when you bring aggregators in, For example, the DERMS system, DER management system that dispatched the DERs, that's really now the aggregators platform, not the utilities. There's going to be some communication from it to the utility for sure. So we need to clearly identify who's deploying these technologies. I do want to say also that we're still discussing these. We may not have a comprehensive list here. We're open to your feedback, and we're certainly have a committee of people that are hammering on these points. So all of this is, consider it all as under development as opposed to final, but you get a sense for the kind of level of detail that we're planning to provide and base our arguments and discussions upon. So the third column is the rationale. You know, what is the need that's driven by FERC 2222, and specifically, you know, what is the technology that's involved? So if we just took one example, Doug was mentioning the issue of the LSE needing to net out the DERs. Look at the second row here. When the LSE submits its bid to the ISO for what its load is going to be, both a forecast and a bid, the aggregators are submitting the bids that for the DERs. So the LSE has to subtract whatever the DERs are bidding from its bid, or make sure that its offer bids do not include the offers from the DERs. And so that's just a level of sophistication that is beyond what is currently the standard process now. And when you read FERC 2222, it's important. It reads like legalese. It's hard to read, but it's important to remember that this is FERC telling the ISOs what they must do, and then asking the ISOs to fill out the details of what they are, how they will respond to what they are required to do by FERC, but with all the practical details filled in. And so all of these are subject to final rulemaking that are one-to-one correspondence between an ISO and FERC. So there will be some differences, and there will be some evolution of how FERC's orders are interpreted. So let's go to the next slide, which is just a continuation of this table. We're getting down into the lower levels of the pyramid now. Most of these are technologies that are involved with the distribution utility. We'll probably add some that are on the customer premises and for the aggregators. Let me just point out in another example, Doug talked about submetering may be required for certain DERs, particularly distributed generation and storage. That's partly because we need to adjust those for retail bills because they're already getting paid wholesale. They don't get paid retail. It has to be netted out of their retail billing system. So you need some submeters and you need some advanced billing capabilities, which is the very next row. So this is the kind of thinking that we are undertaking. A group of experts from the Alliance, from various utilities and various vendors and other disciplines, hammering on these concepts, discussing FERC rulings and how they will be interpreted in practice, and trying to clarify what that means for technology. And that's really, I'll stop there. That's really what we're engaged in. And I think we're happy to entertain questions, aren't we, Karen?
We are. We would welcome questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Karen, Douglas, and Rob. This was really interesting and really helpful, and we're really excited to see the final product. I put a question in the chat to everyone, especially the Public Utility Commission and State Energy Offices on the call, and that is really hoping to get some information from you all on what information within the report, maybe a specific technology or specific information on a wide range of technologies would be helpful, because this is really you're one of the key audiences of this report, and so I think GridWise Alliance and their team want to make sure that your questions are answered too. So while you're pondering that and putting your questions into the chat in the Q&A box. I have a bunch of questions, so I'll get started and then hopefully participants and states will add to it. But one question that I had, and I don't know if you will entertain this in your report, but obviously a lot of these investments will require some significant financial support and financial investments for these utilities. And I was wondering if that was something that was also going to be in the report, or how you see kind of the financial implications of a lot of these technologies.
I think that our report is more around focused on the technologies and not necessarily on how you structure the investments. It's meant to inform those discussions so that, when a, aggregator and a utility and the commission come together and are looking at kind of what grid investments have to be made, that you've got a rationale for what the range of technologies are. I think we are going to tackle some of the market issues that, the compensation issues, not necessarily the front end investments, but if it's helpful, we could include some case studies on the scale of the investment for some of these things, utility by, a couple of utilities that have maybe gone through this process. So we'll see about that. I'm writing myself a note.
Yeah, I think that would be great. I got we have a note in the Q&A box that the recovery of the cost of all these changes and investments is really sort of the sticky point for a lot of public utility commissions, for the IOUs in particular, but I obviously know also daunting to munis and co-ops and others. So I think kind of maybe not guidance, but yeah, kind of information on how some of the PUCs may be having information would be great.
We're also going to note that, which I think is a very important point for cost recovery, which is that many of these technologies provide multiple benefits. And so making sure that you capture all of the benefits, and not just that, you have to deploy this because of FERC Order 2222, but you're also going to get greater visibility into a whole suite of things, or the ability to allow aggregated DER to provide some, immediate resilience benefits in the event of outages, things like that.
Absolutely, and that's a really important point. And also I'd add that we do see these technologies coming in over time. Some of them are needed almost immediately to respond to literal requirements of FERC has imposed. Others are added value that as the DRs penetrate at more and higher percentages, you need more sophisticated technologies to analyze their impacts on your distribution network, as well as what maybe they can do for you. But you don't have to make all these investments on day one, is the key point.
That's a great point. And Rob, the Tennessee Valley Authority permit, will there be some time component to that as well? Like, I know it's sort of step by step and you have to do this first and that first, but kind of like how long some of this technology deployment takes?
Yeah, we're debating on how best to express that, but that's an active part of our discussion. But one way to think about it is there's an early phase where you don't have that many participants. It's not that big a deal. You just need to deal with the accounting and the financial implications here. Then there's another phase when all of a sudden there's a lot going on, and it might really be starting to impact your network. And you better know what's going on, and you should have the right to approve or disapprove of a given offer from DRs. If it's truly going to violate some system constraint, you need to be able to tell them no. And then there's the third stage, which is full integration, where you're really trying to take advantage. And so the investments correlate with that time series of sophistication and time series of penetration on the DRs.
And another thing that we've been talking about is that you may deploy a technology and use one capability early on, but then as you get more and more aggregated DER, you need that technology you need to expand the capabilities that you're getting from it. So we're still trying to figure out the best way to we originally were going to have a table that kind of staggered the deployment of the technologies, and we realized that could be fraught. And so we'll have this discussion about the different stages that Rob described, but then also have the one-pagers on the technologies themselves with the focus on the capabilities that they'll bring to the table.
Great. I think that will be really helpful, especially the staggering, not having this daunting array of technologies to have to deal with right away. So on that staggering point, do you, and this goes a little bit beyond the report, but from your expert opinion, do you see the utilities choice, so to speak, or, the implementer's choice saying, okay, this technology comes next, or we have some funding for this technology, or do you think there is some guidance from state agencies as how that implementation unfolds?
That's a hard question to answer.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of both. The states typically have, objectives that they're trying to achieve at a macro level, and the utility business is not homogeneous. Even your larger investor-owned utilities, they're each different, and even within the very large ones that have multiple opcos, each opco is different, and they are working through trying to rationalize and harmonize systems and applications that are driving this and impacted by it. And no one's quite there yet across an entire footprint on the larger scale. And on the smaller scale, it's kind of like, well, they're constrained by other things, other resource constraints, personnel, expertise, monetary, and it really becomes I need to understand where I'm trying to get to and when at the larger scale, and breaking it down for each unique situation, and I think a great example of that is AMI. You've got some, we're on Gen 5 of AMI right now. And the early adopters of AMI, okay, they spent the money way back when, they got all the justification for it. And now what they're finding is, all right, they deployed it for one use case, collect billing information. And now we're finding, well, to account for DER integrations and to provide the forecast granularity that we need, that's not adequate. I need new assets in the field. So just to say I have AMI, I'm good, check the box. Well, maybe not. You may have already spent the money for a full AMI rollout, and now you have to update it or upgrade it. And that's just a fact of where the technology is and the capabilities required by the things such as FERC 2222.
A perfect example of what Doug just cited is if you need to talk to your AMI meters in real time or quasi real time, then the networks that are typically deployed for AMI are not capable of that near instantaneous communication. So if we had sub-meters and so forth, and we're trying to do all this analysis in real time, that the current AMI network, the comms part of the network, may need to be upgraded for that. Will need to be upgraded for that.
And I would say too that to Doug's point about you might have to upgrade your AMI. I think that this is an area that we keep hammering home, particularly because we've had some kind of disturbing conversations with DOE and others about, well, AMI is widely deployed, so we don't need to use the recovery, the infrastructure money for that.
Oop, Karen, you just muted yourself.
I'm talking with my hands and I muted myself. When you look at the data for the deployment of AMI, even where in New England it's like 20-something%, and even in places like Nevada and Washington D.C. where it's over 90%, you may not have the AMI that's producing that really granular. It may be 15-minute or 5-minute intervals, and you may need something much more granular. And so I think this whole issue of AMI investments, really, I think we're probably going to do a paper on that at some point soon, because I think there's so many benefits for resilience and return. I've got a slide that shows 2 counties in Florida, or all the counties in Florida, and the percentage of deployment of smart meters. And then the next slide, next to it is the map with the counties and the SAIDI and SAFE data. And of course, the counties that have the lowest AMI deployments from 0 to 10% have by far the longest recovery times after storm outages. And yet a lot of the debate that happens at the commission over AMI, particularly with some of the interveners, revolves around, like, do you have a time of use plan? And in fact, there's so much more that we need to be focused on in terms of what the really advanced AMI will provide to the system and to the customer. So I think that I'm getting off on a little bit of a tangent on the AMI thing, but it is so critical for this paper. You can't do this without the really advanced AMI. But then beyond that, everything we're trying to get out of a modern grid, that is pretty much the basic building block.
No, absolutely. And this dovetails a lot with a few comments I wanted to just relay that we got in terms of information. One attendee said we could use information on what level of higher bandwidth is needed to get to the varying degrees of visibility through AMI. How do we evaluate whether sufficient broadband and telecom infrastructure in an area exists to support certain technologies, especially in rural and remote areas? They can access broadband maps, but don't know how to reconcile that with the technologies that are needed. So I think the understanding of AMI and how this all works with broadband might not be part of this paper, but I think there's appetite on the NASEO and NARUC membership to understand that more.
It is a line item, and it's communications. And I think we have to distinguish between broadband that you're looking at with the telecom maps and broadband as part of a utility communication network, which could, if overbuilt, provide internet service to its customers as well. And the prime example for that is EPB in Chattanooga that used the Recovery Act money to invest in their smart grid, including an advanced broadband communication network as their internal utility communications platform that's critical. But then they also provide access to that system because they have excess capacity to their customers for high-speed internet. And there is, FYI, there's $1 billion over at Commerce for the middle mile broadband, which is only for utilities, and utilities can use that for their networks for their smart grid networks, but also build that excess capacity. And then the $42.5 billion over at Commerce for broadband. There's language there that prevents the states from preventing utilities from using that money if they want to provide broadband. Most won't use that money because it's strictly for broadband, but we certainly will be talking about broadband quite a bit in going forward. And we'd love to do another webinar with you on utility communications because it's so critical to everything. Including this, but there is a difference between like the broadband maps that you were talking about and then the utility broadband.
Great, yes, and definitely going to take you up on that offer for the webinar and more work on the broadband energy connection. One other request from a state energy office to include more info on DER submetering, because they end up reviewing and providing financial assistance to some DER projects, and to just understand what sort of the requirements are and make sure that those are met.
Yeah.
And then one other question or concern that came in that you might have answered already, but I wanted to ask again and just make sure it's either part of the report. I think that a lot of the state agencies, both PUCs and state energy offices, are kind of grappling with this quantification of benefits that you mentioned, the resilience benefits, equity benefits. A lot of this is obviously being asked through some of the federal grant programs that are being stood up. And I think there was a question in the chat how to quantify those benefits, and I don't want to get into the how quite here, but I wanted to ask if that was also part of when you're describing the technologies to describe how what kind of benefits they could potentially provide.
Yes, to the extent that we can. For this, we're really focused not on benefits, but capabilities, so that we're not necessarily providing data for benefit costs, analysis that would go with a rate case, but really just here are the kinds of technologies that you're going to need and the functions that they provide to the grid. So probably not, but we did just have a really interesting conversation with DOE and the GRIP people, and as they're trying to think about resilience metrics. And so we're going to try to wrap some of those into our grid modernization index, but not necessarily, I think, in this particular paper. Well, our goal is to get this paper out by the end of February. So it may be a while before we have really good resilience metrics that we could actually, and then the data to show what each of these technologies would provide in terms of benefits.
Great. Yes. Oh, go ahead, Robert.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think Karen already said that many of these technologies have multiple benefits outside of just responding to FERC 2222. And at minimum, I think we sort of have an action item to at least enumerate those, if not quantify those. We can't go that far at this point. But we need to make very, very clear whether this is central and the main reason you're buying something is for 2222, or that this is something that's used for 6 other things, and oh, by the way, it'll help us out with for 2222 as well. So it's kind of a roadmap for people to build quantification estimates with.
Yeah, I think that would be super helpful, because obviously we also want to keep in mind the states that are not part of an organized market. And so FERC Order 2222 might not be, that the immediate concern, but certainly there's this question of benefits and DER increase in all the states. So I think that would be super helpful. Last call for the audience. I still have a few questions I want to go through, but if you have any other burning questions, please put them in the Q&A box, or any suggestions. Doesn't have to be a question, but suggestions what this paper should provide in terms of information. And I wanted to ask if you were also, maybe not with this paper, but if there are any other lessons learned from outside of the US in terms of technologies and technology implementation. When a person was mentioning South Australia as an example, I don't know if that is part of this, or if there's sort of a call out box for some of the outside US experiences.
It's not something that we've discussed explicitly, but there are some good examples of technologies that have been deployed first elsewhere. And your question is a good reminder to us to make sure that we bring some of those forward as relevant. Great.
And on the resilience benefit question, going back one, I would be remiss to not mention that both NARUC and NASEO are working together with the DOE and the DDO office this year on supporting the state energy offices and POCs, also on this kind of grid resilience planning, and the conversation on grid resilience measures and metrics and benefits will certainly be part of that. So hopefully with all our combined efforts, we can make headway on grid resilience and measuring grid resilience benefits. I think one comment, just to also go back on the AMI example, came in that the AMI example is a good reminder of the bind that some of these developments put state PUCs in. The customers are still paying for some of the first generation that was deployed, and now are being asked to pay for another kind of installment, and it's the person in the question sort of compared it to the new version of the iPhone where you always have to buy the new thing. And sometimes I think it's unclear for the customers too, to understand why it's necessary. And I know that's not part of the paper, but this is a good reminder for us, all of us, I think, sometimes to maybe also think about how to message some of these investments that are needed.
Well, I do think it speaks to the business models that we're all grappling with, because we're talking about technology obsolescence, and we are used to dealing with 20 to 30 year lived assets, and we're now looking at digital substations and rapidly evolving technology. And the question is, are you gilding the lily, or do you really need the functions that those technologies provide? And I think that justification, that's part of the reason why we're doing this, is to explain what the uses are and the multiple uses are, so that as the justification is built, you're capturing the benefits across those different streams. But we don't have it. We don't have it right yet. So we're in a period of crazy rapid change. Doug?
Yeah, I think, Karen, a point that I try to emphasize is, if you look at what we've become accustomed to, that 20, 30, even 50-year lived assets, why have they been able to live that long and provide what they provide for that long? Well, the system has been over-engineered for decades, okay? And it's an engineered solution, which means it can do what you designed it to do, and it can do nothing else. Okay, going forward in the era of dynamic change, the number one thing that utility operators need is flexibility, so that they can react to, we're talking a lot about resilience. Well, I can be more resilient if I'm more flexible. If I build flexibility into my infrastructure and into the delivery networks and into the assets, I can use them to do everything they're capable of doing, and I don't have to have that all predefined in an engineered solution. And I think that's really the value proposition of the newer technologies, is they can do 10 things as opposed to 1 or 2. And I think if you looked at it in totality, the cost is probably about the same. It just gets reallocated. It's not all in the physical poles and wires and transformers, the hard assets that do that 1 or 2 things. It's in, things that have compute technology and electronic and control technology that, enable you to do multiple things. But they also do not last as long. Physically, they may last. Your laptop from 20 years ago, it would still work if the vendors still supported it. If the software still, was able to work, it would work. And we've got the same thing going forward. So.
Thank you. I totally agree. One thing that that also came in the chat, a question that maybe goes beyond the paper too, but maybe it's the second paper. It's a question of data and how the data is captured. And the question is, do you think it's important to standardize how the data is captured from the beginning? So that as new technologies are implemented, you don't have to rework what and how information is captured.
I do a lot of work with this, and there are some really good engineering standards out there. The big one in regard to DERs today is IEEE 2030.5, and it standardizes not only the data elements but also how they're communicated. It's an XML based protocol, so it can be parsed by just about any system. But why is that important? For exactly what the question, described. It's so that when I try to integrate together different types of technologies, I'm not building all these custom integrations. I have a known data set coming in. I have a known method of consuming that data. And again, it's all about that flexibility thing. I don't have to describe every aspect of the data set. As long as I describe the structure of the data set, I can consume it. And whether that gets imposed through regulation, I think it's there in a soft manner in many regulations. The challenge is industry acceptance, and it's scaling to the point where the standard becomes beneficial for the vendors in the space to actually propagate it. And that's not happened with a lot of standards in the past. I think 2030.5 has a much larger basis for that to happen, and it alleviates a lot of the issues.
I'll just bring it back to broadband, which is that in addition to standardizing the data, right now data is collected across the utility system and may be transmitted, over different communication networks. And I was looking at my notes because one of our members is Anterix, which bought up the 5G wireless network and is working with utilities on wireless broadband communication networks. And one of their major utility clients is replacing over 20 legacy communication networks. Everything from how you communicate with your lineman to how you communicate with your customer to how a particular sensor sends data back to the grid operator with one communication network. And the benefit of that is that the data will be moving into a central location so that you won't have these silos of data. So that's another reason why it's not just about moving the massive amounts of data that you're going to need, but it's about having them sort of moving together and not being siloed.
Yeah, the private LTE infrastructure is a game changer. One of the challenges in this area is throughput and latency. Bandwidth is one thing. That's how big is the pipe. How much water I can put through that pipe is throughput. And that's not just restricted by the size, but the private LTE addresses a lot of the challenges in the communications infrastructure, predominantly latency, which is I send a message, how long does it take to get to the other end, and how long does their response take to get back to me? In a lot of these applications, a lot of these use cases, that needs to be very quick. It can't be minutes, it has to be sub-minute. And a lot of those legacy communication technologies, it may or may not meet that. And that's actually why there's so many in the typical utility stack, is because they're carrying the legacy things that didn't need high throughput, didn't need low latency, and they've put 10 things out in the field and they need high throughput and low latency, so they just added on another system to get that. And what we see in a lot of instances is you have a lot of technical debt that is difficult to maintain and integrate with beyond what it is. Again, it's an engineered solution. It is not very flexible. It does these 10 things maybe and no more. Don't ask for the 11th. It's not going to happen. You need something new.
Great, thank you so much. That just opens up more questions and more food for thought and more need to dialogue, which I'm hopeful we can continue as we support state energy offices and the public utility commissions and understanding kind of the needs and the requests that are going to come their way by many various actors. So thank you so much, Karen, Rob, and Douglas, for joining us today. And outlining what your report will look like. And hopefully we can continue this conversation, and we're excited to see the report when it comes out next month.
Great. Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk to everybody.
Yes, thank you. And thank you everybody for attending. Have a good day now. Bye.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks.